I should have known something was wrong the moment Nathan insisted on the burgundy dress. Not the emerald one I'd picked out weeks before, the one that made my eyes look less tired and more alive. The one hanging on the back of my closet door like a promise. But the burgundy slip dress he'd bought himself and left on my bed with a neat little note about how it would be perfect for tonight. At the time, I told myself to let it go. I was 29. I'd learned to pick my battles, and a dress didn't feel worth a fight. Especially not on the night he said we were celebrating our engagement anniversary. The elevator doors opened into the top floor of Lakeshore Tower, and the Aurora room unfolded in front of me like the inside of a jewelry box, chandeliers dripping crystal, floor-to-ceiling windows framing Chicago's skyline, and the black mirror of Lake Michigan. I'd been there once before, when my firm celebrated my promotion to lead architect. That night, Nathan had complained about the prices all through dessert. Tonight, he'd made the reservation himself. The host greeted me with a professional smile that didn't quite reach his eyes and said my table was ready. The way he phrased it stuck with me. My table, my party, not my fiancé, not Mr. Cole is already here. My heels clicked too loudly on the marble, every step echoing. I walked past tables full of people whose faces I recognized from magazine covers and campaign posters, and the Chicago's 40 under 40 lists I pretended not to care about. Old money, new money, and whatever category Nathan was trying to climb into. Our table was near the center of the room, prime real estate if your goal was to be seen. Nathan was there. So was Charlotte Pierce. If you've never seen your replacement sitting in your chair before you get there, I don't recommend it. Charlotte looked exactly like she did in the business profiles. Long blonde waves, perfect posture, that effortless old money polish. Her dress probably cost more than my car. I could practically hear the Pierce family PR machine humming behind her. I stopped a few steps from the table. The leather portfolio in my hand, holding the blueprints I'd been obsessing over for a month, suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Nathan stood up with the smile he used at fundraisers. Not the one he used to have at 2 in the morning when we were eating cold pizza on my couch. He thanked me for coming, like I was a potential donor who'd agreed to meet at the last minute. Then he launched into a speech about his future, his plans to run for state senate, the optics of his personal life, and how he needed a partner who understood that world from birth. He never used the word upgrade. He didn't have to. He talked about Charlotte's family, her connections, and how she'd grown up in front of cameras. When he glanced at me, it was with a kind of distant affection, like I was an intern he'd have to let go after restructuring. He mentioned my sudden promotion at the firm, and how some people might think I'd been with him for the access, for his network, for how it looked. I felt my fingers tightening around the portfolio as my brain tried to catch up. This was the man who used to drive me to construction sites on Sunday mornings so I could stare at concrete pours and talk about structural loads. Now he was implying my career was a side effect of his last name. What I remember most isn't his words. It's the way the room changed. Conversations dimmed. The air thickened. The soft clink of cutlery and glass slowed like someone was turning a volume knob. People didn't look directly at us, but I could feel their attention like heat on my skin. Phones appeared, held low but angled just right. This was a room full of people trained to smell blood in the water. At some point, Nathan reached into his jacket and pulled out the ring box. My ring. The one that had been digging into my finger for weeks. I'd left it on his bathroom counter for resizing. He opened the box, took the ring out, and set it on the table between us like he was returning a keycard at checkout. He said he hoped I understood this was best for both of us. He said I'd find someone better suited to my background. He said I was ambitious and that it was probably for the best that our paths were diverging now, before things became messier. I didn't say anything clever. I didn't deliver a line that would make him wake up at 3 for the rest of his life in a cold sweat. What I did was drop the portfolio. It hit the floor with a dull thud and burst open, my blueprints sliding across the marble like they were nothing. Those drawings represented a month of my life. Late nights at the office, coffee that tasted like cardboard, my name attached to something I was proud of, and there they were, fanned out at his feet like trash. He didn't even glance at them. I knelt down and gathered the pages with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. Then I stood, left the ring on the table, and told him very calmly that he could keep it. In my head, I tagged it as payment for the year I'd wasted. The host studiously avoided my eyes as I walked back through the Aurora room, portfolio clutched to my chest. I felt the phones tracking me, the pitying looks, the faint twists of amusement, the woman at the center of the live drama, the cautionary tale. By the time the elevator doors closed, my throat hurt from holding everything in. Outside, Chicago slapped me in the face. October wind off the lake doesn't care if your life just imploded. It cuts straight through silk and pretense and leaves you raw. I made it half a block before my legs gave out. I ended up on the curb, the burgundy dress pooling around me, blueprints pressed against my ribs like they could hold me together. And that's when the tears came hot, humiliating, unstoppable. A year of building a future in my head, burned down in front of 200 strangers who were probably already typing hashtags about it. At some point, curiosity and self-loathing teamed up and made me pull out my phone. The clip was already online. A shaky video of me standing there frozen, while Nathan explained why I wasn't enough. The views had a 5-digit number attached. The comments were worse. Half the internet had decided I was a gold digger who'd finally been exposed. The other half was analyzing my expression like I was some case study in trauma. I was still staring at the screen when I heard footsteps approach. A man's voice cut through the noise in my head. Calm, low, not quite gentle, but not cruel either. It wasn't a question, it was an assessment. He'd seen the way I was sitting, the way my shoulders shook, the way my phone screen glowed with my worst moments streaming on repeat. He told me there were photographers coming around the corner. He told me if I stayed where I was, tomorrow morning's feeds would be full of my smeared mascara and wrinkled dress. He said he had a car waiting if I wanted to leave before that happened. Everything my mother ever told me about stranger danger surfaced at once. I didn't know his name. I didn't know why he was there. For all I knew, getting into that car would turn tonight's humiliation into the opening scene of a true crime podcast. Then I heard the first shout. That particular desperate excitement reporters get when they think they smell a story. I saw the angle of one camera already turning in my direction. I remember looking up. He was standing a few feet away, backlit by a street lamp. Tall, easily over 6 feet. Dark hair, darker eyes, the kind of bone structure that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His suit was black, tailored, and expensive without being flashy. The only thing that really stood out was the way he held himself. Relaxed but coiled, like he could switch from polite conversation to violence in a heartbeat if he had to. I didn't have time to weigh every risk. Survival instinct blinked, and my hand moved. I took his. He pulled me up in one smooth motion, guided me toward a black car idling at the curb, and opened the back door. I slid inside with my portfolio still clutch-locked to my chest. He followed. The door shut, slicing off the shouts and the flash of cameras just as 3 men with lenses turned the corner. The interior of the car smelled like leather, and something understated and expensive. City lights streaked past the tinted windows. The driver pulled away without needing instruction. I pressed my back against the opposite door, heart pounding, and finally managed to ask him who he was. He didn't introduce himself right away. Instead, he summarized what had just happened upstairs with unnerving accuracy, as if he'd watched the whole thing from a balcony. Successful young lawyer, ambitious campaign, old money fiancé, viral humiliation. Then he told me to check my phone again. The video had doubled in views. My notifications were a blur of texts from colleagues, missed calls from my older sister, and a couple of emails from my firm with subject lines that started with, "We should talk about." I knew what that meant. My promotion as lead architect had always come with the unspoken clause that I needed to be good for the firm's image. Nobody wrote that down. They didn't have to. I heard myself say, in a voice that sounded like it belonged to someone else, that I was probably going to be out of a job by the end of the week. That was when he finally told me what he wanted. He said he needed a wife. Not forever. Not romantically. For 6 months. He laid it out like a business proposal. He was negotiating with several old-school families who liked to see stability. A ring on his finger and a woman at his side would grease wheels and calm suspicions. He didn't want the mess of real feelings. What he wanted was an arrangement. In exchange, he promised 2 things. First, he would transfer $500,000 to my account once his deal closed, with a clause ensuring I got the money even if things fell apart for reasons that weren't my fault. Second, he would make sure Nathan Cole's political career died before it ever really began. $500,000 in revenge, served cold, from the backseat of a luxury car. I laughed. It came out high and shaky because nothing about that offer was funny. I asked him, or rather, I remember thinking as I told him, that he had to be insane if he thought I'd just sign myself over to a stranger like a rental agreement. He finally gave me his name, Marco Santoro. Even someone like me, who avoided crime documentaries and switched the channel when trial coverage came on, had heard that name. Chicago whispers it when it's talking about the docks, about certain construction contracts, about shipments that come in under the radar. Nothing proven. Everything rumored. Sitting next to him, those rumors felt real. I told myself I'd say no, that I'd get out of the car at the first red light, walk home, and figure out my life tomorrow like a rational adult. But he didn't drop me at a red light. He dropped me in front of my building, at the cracked front steps of the walk-up I'd been living in since grad school. Before I got out, he handed me a plain white business card with a single number printed in clean black ink. No name, no logo, just 10 digits. He told me that if I called, someone would answer. And then the car slid back into traffic and vanished. I spent 2 days pretending I'd thrown that card away. I went to the office and pretended not to see the way people glanced at me and quickly looked back at their screens. My boss called me in and suggested, very carefully, that I might want to take some personal time while things blew over. A client emailed to say they were reconsidering our partnership in light of recent visibility. By the morning of the third day, I was sitting at my tiny kitchen table, staring at that card like it was a bomb. I didn't have a job offer waiting somewhere else. My reputation was sliding into meme territory. The man I'd been willing to marry had traded me in for better optics and then let an entire room record my humiliation. $500,000 sounded obscene. It also sounded like a way out. I dialed the number. The phone barely rang once before a male voice answered. No greeting. No small talk. Just a question about my address. I told him. The line went dead. 20 minutes later, a red sedan I'd never seen before idled at the curb outside my building. I got in. The car took me away from my half-unpacked boxes and peeling paint and toward the industrial edges of the city, the parts where warehouses leaned against each other, and the streetlights buzzed. From the outside, the building we stopped at could have been abandoned. Inside, it was all glass partitions, brushed steel, and the low hum of servers. There were men stationed in corners and hallways, who watched me the way structural engineers look at old bridges, checking for cracks, calculating failure points. When I walked into Marco's office, he didn't stand. He just watched me cross the room. Daylight didn't make him less intimidating. It just sharpened the lines. His suit was different charcoal this time, but everything else was the same. The intensity, the stillness. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk and slid a stack of papers toward me. The contract was short and terrifyingly clear. For 6 months, I would be his wife in every way that mattered to the outside world. I would move into his home, attend events with him, learn his friends' names and his enemies' faces. We would share a front for the cameras. Behind closed doors, there would be separate bedrooms. No expectation of intimacy unless we both decided otherwise, and it served the story we were projecting. I was free to continue my work as an architect. He would not interfere with which projects I took on, as long as they didn't compromise his safety or that of his organization. The marriage would be legal, but we would have pre-signed divorce papers ready to file the moment our 6 months were up. On his side, he promised the $500,000 and the ruin of Nathan Cole's career, both in writing. Both were enforceable in ways that sounded vague but final. I read every line twice. There were no romantic flourishes, no "in case we fall in love" escape clauses, just liabilities and responsibilities. My hand shook when I picked up the pen. At any point, I could have walked out. I could have crumpled the paperwork and said I wasn't for sale. I could have chosen pride and poverty and a slow, painful attempt to rebuild a life that had been knocked off its axis. Instead, I signed my name on the line marked Riley Carter and felt something in my chest shift. Marco signed his name below mine, quick and decisive. Like this wasn't the strangest thing he'd done that week. He didn't say congratulations. He didn't say welcome. He simply stood, extended his hand, and said a word that made my throat tighten. Wife. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't soft. It was a label, a role. I took his hand anyway. A few hours later, I was standing in the entryway of a penthouse in the Gold Coast, shoes sinking into a thick white rug, staring at a wall of glass that made Lake Michigan look close enough to touch. Everything about the place was understated and expensive. Clean lines, pale wood, art that felt like it had been chosen, not purchased in bulk. There was a bedroom with my name on it. Light. Someone had written Riley on a sticky note and attached it to the door. Inside, the bed was bigger than my old living room. The closet was stocked with clothes in my size, and a small safe hummed quietly in the corner. When I opened it, I found jewelry that made my eyes water. Diamonds, emeralds, pearls, all organized in neat velvet rows. There was an index card taped to the inside of the door with a combination spelled out in numbers that matched my birthday. I didn't know whether to be flattered or unnerved. I didn't meet Marco's sister until that evening. I was in the kitchen pretending to figure out the coffee machine when the elevator opened directly into the apartment, and a woman in a charcoal suit stepped out like she owned the building. She had Marco's dark eyes and sharp features, but where his presence felt like a storm contained behind glass, hers felt like bright, precise lightning. She looked me up and down in one sweep bare feet, borrowed leggings, oversized sweatshirt, and it took effort not to pull at my sleeves. She introduced herself as Elena, not, "Nice to meet you," just her name and the barest nod in my direction. Then she proceeded to outline, in clinical detail, exactly what I'd signed up for. Being married to Marco Santoro on paper or otherwise meant becoming a target. There were people who would see me as leverage. There were enemies who would use me to hurt him if they could. Curiosity was dangerous. Questions about parts of the business that existed in shadows were more dangerous. She told me, very plainly, that ignorance could be a form of protection, that if someone ever put a gun to my head and demanded information, it would be better for everyone if I didn't have many answers to give. I remember gripping the edge of the countertop to keep my hands from shaking. I remember thinking that this was the first time anyone had ever framed not knowing as a form of power. When Elena finally paused, I told her, as evenly as I could, that I understood, or at least that I was trying to. She gave me another long, measuring look and said she hoped I was as competent as her brother seemed to think I was. Then she disappeared down the hall, her heels muffled by the rug. That night, I lay awake in the most comfortable bed I'd ever touched, staring at the ceiling and listening to the quiet hum of a security system more advanced than anything I'd ever seen. I thought about Nathan and Charlotte laughing somewhere over a bottle of celebratory champagne. I thought about the Aurora room. I thought about the fact that I had legally attached my name to a man whose family was the kind people whispered about in half sentences. Somehow, despite all of that, I slept. I woke up fully around 6:30 the next morning, 6:30 because the smell of coffee drifted under my door. When I padded out to the kitchen in bare feet, Marco was sitting at the island with a mug in his hand, sleeves rolled up, reading something on a tablet. He didn't look like a man who terrified prosecutors. He looked like someone who'd accidentally wandered into an interior design magazine. He glanced up, gave the smallest nod, and slid a second mug across the counter. That became a rhythm. Not an easy one. Not always. But a rhythm. I spent my mornings digging into personal projects I'd never had time for when the firm owned my calendar. I was halfway through redesigning a mixed-use building in my head to better capture lake breezes when an email from HR officially put me on indefinite paid leave pending reputational review. We both knew what that meant. So did Marco when I showed him, though he didn't comment. Some evenings, he was gone before I woke up and home after I fell asleep. Some nights, we crossed paths at the kitchen island around 22 and traded a handful of sentences about our days without actually saying much at all. We were strangers, sharing a contract and a space, polite, distant, orbiting each other carefully. Then the gala changed everything. I found out about it 3 nights after I moved in. Marco mentioned, almost in passing, that there was a charity event we needed to attend at the museum. He needed to be seen with his wife in the right rooms. It would help settle questions. It would signal stability. He also mentioned that Nathan and Charlotte would almost certainly be there. The dress waiting in my closet the next day was deep navy. The fabric slipped against my skin like it had been poured instead of sewn. I chose simple earrings, tied my hair back, and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I expected to see the woman from the viral clip, the one standing there with dropped shoulders and 2 wide eyes while her life fell apart. Instead, I saw someone else. Still bruised, still tired, but standing straighter. On the museum steps that night, the flash of cameras felt familiar. The shouted questions were different, though. They were about Marco, about deals and alliances, about whether rumors were true that he'd married quietly. He offered me his hand as I stepped out of the car. It was a formality, a prop, part of the performance. It didn't feel like just that when his fingers slid around mine. Security parted the sea of reporters, and we walked inside. The main hall was a swirl of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns, laughter pinned to faces that never quite reached the eyes. If you'd asked anyone there what they did, their answers would have been boring. Investments, real estate, hospitality, politics. None of those words ever covered the full truth. I saw Nathan before he saw me. He was standing near the center of the room, Charlotte on his arm, answering a question from a local news anchor. He looked good under the lights. He always did. Camera ready, every angle practiced. His gaze slid past me first, paused, and snapped back as he'd just tasted something bitter. I watched the exact moment he recognized me, then the moment he registered who I was. My stomach tightened, but what surprised me most was that the old ache didn't hit quite as hard. The humiliation was still there, a faint echo, but it was layered now with something else, something closer to distance. Marco's hand on my lower back gently redirected me. We didn't avoid Nathan and Charlotte. We walked toward them. I won't repeat the entire interaction. That part of my life has been replayed and analyzed enough times. What I remember is this. This time, when people around us started watching, it wasn't because they were enjoying a public execution. It was because they were trying to understand why a woman they'd seen broken on camera was now walking calmly on the arm of a man whose name made mayors sweat. Later, in a quieter gallery, I met Luca Romano. He was shorter than Marco, thicker around the middle, but no less dangerous. He was surrounded by men who radiated thug energy in expensive suits, and he was gesturing at a set of architectural plans laid out on a table as if he owned the building they described already. The plans were for a warehouse and office complex near the river. To anyone else, it probably looked like exactly what he claimed, a logistics hub with some mixed-use throw-ins. To me, the foundation notes were screaming. Red flags stacked up as my eyes ran down the page, shallow pilings for a building that tall on river-adjacent soil, load-bearing walls in stupid places, circulation patterns that didn't match the stated purpose. I hadn't planned to say anything. I was supposed to be background noise, beautiful and quiet. The new wife whose job was to smile and not embarrass anyone. Marco, unfortunately, had other ideas. He asked what I thought, casually, as if we were back at my old firm, standing over a junior's draft. I felt everyone's attention shift. Luca's, his men's. The men in suits pretend not to listen. I could have played dumb. I could have shrugged and said it looked fine. Instead, I inhaled and did what I'd trained my entire adult life to do. I pointed out the foundation issue first, how the soil there behaved, the risk of settlement. I talked about water tables and frost lines and how you don't build 8 stories on wishful thinking. I mentioned how certain corridor widths made more sense for moving crates than desks. I kept my voice even and as free from judgment as possible. I framed it as concern, not accusation. The silence at the end of my little impromptu critique was heavy. Luca smiled with his mouth, not his eyes. He made some comment filtered through my memory now as something between patronizing and irritated about how his engineers had assured him everything was safe. I replied, gently, that sometimes engineers missed things. The thing about people like Luca is that they can handle being challenged by other men. They hate being exposed by someone they'd already decided didn't matter. We left that gallery before anything uglier could happen. As we walked away, I heard the polite end of a conversation in Italian between him and one of his men. I didn't need the words to know I'd been promoted on his mental list from irrelevant wife to problem. On the ride back to the penthouse that night, Marco poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass and pushed it in my direction. He didn't thank me out loud. He didn't need to. The way his eyes lingered on me said enough. He told me, in his own way, that what I'd done had probably shut down a very specific kind of operation before it could open. That I had put a crack in Luca's plans that other people would notice and widen. He also told me, with fewer words and more silence, that this might have consequences. He was right. The threat came a week later. By then, our lives had settled into something I still don't quite know how to describe. We were still, officially, a business arrangement, but we had begun to move around each other like people who were learning each other's rhythms. Some mornings, she was still at the table at 2, laptop glowing, when I got up for water. Some nights he'd come home with the sharpness of a bad meeting still clinging to him, and I'd talk about beams and facades just to give his mind something else to focus on. It was on one of those in-between days that Griffin, his head of security, called. Griffin was the sort of man you didn't notice until you really looked. Not because he wasn't imposing he was, but because he moved like he was part of the background. He'd driven me enough places by then that I trusted his quiet more than most people's chatter. He told Marco that one of the site managers at a construction project had found a note taped to her office door. The note mentioned me by role, not by name, but it was clear. It said to tell Santoro that his architect wife should stay out of things that didn't concern her. We drove to the site in the south of the city under skies the color of old steel. It was a typical build. Steel skeleton reaching up 6 stories, scaffolding hugging the sides, the smell of concrete and dust hanging in the air. Workers glanced our way with the particular mix of curiosity and wariness you reserve for someone who signs paychecks and someone who can make you disappear. The site manager, a woman in her 50s with a hard hat and the permanent squint of someone who'd seen too many RFIs, handed Marco the note. I read it over his arm. Fear is a strange emotion. Sometimes it hits you like a wave, knocking you off your feet. Sometimes it slides in quietly and settles in your bones. This was the second kind. I'd known, abstractly, that I was stepping into danger by attaching myself to him. Seeing it inked in block letters, hanging off ordinary office tape, made it real in a way nothing else had. I told myself the only logical thing to do was to take the security upgrades he wanted to throw around me like armor and get through the remaining months of the contract. I never got the chance to say that out loud. The explosion wasn't cinematic. There was no ball of fire shooting into the sky. It was a muffled thump from somewhere below us, followed by a shudder that ran up through the structure. The kind of sound that makes seasoned workers go from relaxed to alert in a breath. Someone shouted. Someone else yelled about gas. You could smell it a second later, a sharp chemical cut through the dust. I remember Marco's hand closing around my arm, hard and uncompromising. I remember the way he shifted his body, so I was between him and the interior of the building as we moved toward the temporary stairs. Griffin appeared with his hand under his jacket, eyes scanning, voice level as he reported that a gas main had ruptured in the basement. It might have been an accident. It might not. Either way, we were getting out. It took less than 5 minutes to reach the car, but my heart didn't slow until we were several blocks away, and the construction site was a shrinking geometry in the rearview mirror. Marco's fingers stayed on my knee the entire time. Not gentle, not quite painful, like he needed the skin-to-skin contact to confirm I was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice was rawer than I'd ever heard it. He told me that this wasn't worth $500,000 anymore, that it wasn't worth any amount of money, that he would end the contract that night, file the divorce papers, wire the funds anyway, and send me somewhere far away with a new name if that's what it took. He said he couldn't watch someone he cared about die because of him again. That was how I learned about his first wife. He told me in pieces, in the uneven cadence of someone ripping off a bandage that 7 years ago he'd been in love enough to marry, that he'd believed he could keep the woman he loved separate from the uglier parts of his world, that he'd been wrong. One rainy night, a car had pushed them off the road. He lived. She didn't. The message had been clear. The guilt had been worse. He swore, sitting there in the dim light of the underground garage, that he'd built entire empires since then on the foundation of one rule: never give anyone that kind of hold over him again. Never love anyone enough that their death could be used as collateral. And then he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, that somewhere between the night he'd found me on a curb and the afternoon in the warehouse district, that rule had been compromised. As he was talking, my own fear settled into something else. Not smaller exactly, just reframed. If I left, I'd be safer. Probably, maybe. The people who wanted to hurt him might lose interest in me. But I knew, with a clarity that made my chest hurt, that I would never see myself the same way again if I let my life be swung around by someone else's fear twice in a row. Nathan had already made choices for me. I refused to let Marco do the same, even if his was rooted in love instead of selfishness. So I told him slowly, in fits, with more honesty than I'd given anyone in years, that I wasn't going anywhere. I would rather face risks with my eyes open than run away and spend the rest of my life jumping at shadows. I told him I needed the whole picture. No more half-truths framed as protection. If I was going to be in danger anyway, I wanted the information that might help me survive it. He studied me for a long time, jaw tight, fingers still on my knee. Then something in his face shifted, like a piece of armor sliding out of place. We kissed. I wish I could say it started softly. It didn't. It started like a collision. Two people who had been circling the same gravity well for weeks finally gave in. There was fear in it, and relief, and a kind of desperation that comes from realizing how close you came to losing something you hadn't even admitted you wanted. When we finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, our breathing unsteady, the contract felt like the least important document binding us. He agreed to tell me everything he could, or at least, everything that directly affected my safety. The first piece of that was this. Luca Romano wasn't working without inside information. Someone in Marco's orbit was feeding him details. Someone who knew where I'd be that afternoon. Someone who had access to construction schedules and security rotations. A traitor. The next morning, the dining table turned into a crime board. Papers spread out, names highlighted, lines drawn. Marco, Elena, and Griffin went over lists of people who'd known about the site visit. Project managers, lawyers, politicians, drivers, and security staff. I was supposed to stay in the bedroom with the door closed and a movie on, pretending I didn't know my life was being cross-referenced in bullet points. That lasted less than 2 hours. I walked out to the table and told them, as calmly as my shaking hands allowed, that if someone was trying to kill me, I refused to be exiled to a corner of my own life. Elena sided with me, which surprised all three of us. She pointed out that keeping me ignorant had not, in fact, stopped anyone from taping notes to doors or blowing gas lines. Giving me information might not either, but at least it would give me agency. Marco relented. Reluctantly. He walked me through the list of 23 people who'd had access to my schedule or his. Most of the names meant nothing to me. A few belonged to political donors I'd seen at events. One belonged to a law firm that made my stomach drop. Cole and Myers. Nathan's firm. I remembered him bragging months ago about landing a huge client in the construction industry. I remembered teasing him about finally understanding my world. I remembered him leaving contracts on the coffee table while he went to shower and me flipping through them in idle curiosity, tracing the outline of lots and buildings I never thought I'd step foot on. Now, looking at that name printed on a list of people who'd had the opportunity to leak, an ugly picture was forming. Marco added another piece. His sources, those particular euphemistic words, had mentioned that Nathan had picked up a gambling problem in the past year. Nothing catastrophic yet. Enough to be a liability later. Enough to need cash in amounts he couldn't admit to in campaign disclosures. Information is currency in that world. So are secrets. If Nathan had access to deal documents and project schedules through his firm, Luca would have been happy to trade money and protection for a peek behind the curtain. I didn't want to believe Nathan would have been willing to put me in danger specifically, but the more we traced the timelines, the thinner that denial got. We decided to bait the leak. I say we, because I was part of that conversation. I insisted on it. We came up with a fictitious development project along the river, a dream for someone like Luca. Enough warehouses and loading docks to hide all sorts of things. Enough office space to make it look legitimate. My job was to make it look real. So I did what I'd always done. I designed. I stayed up too late, hunched over drafting software and trace paper, building a building that would never exist. It was almost therapeutic, in a twisted way. I got to focus on setbacks and egress routes instead of hitmen and exploding gas lines. We then seeded the existence of that project into the places we suspected Nathan might be watching. Secure data sites his firm handled for Marco's shell companies, texts that could be intercepted, and calendar entries that would show an investor presentation scheduled at a warehouse in the industrial district at 14 a few days out. Then we waited. The day of the presentation, I dressed like I was really going to pitch to a room full of people who could sign checks with more zeros than I'd ever seen. Smart black dress, hair pinned back, a portfolio under my arm that held nothing anyone could actually use beyond that day. The warehouse itself had been scrubbed within an inch of its life. From the outside, it was just another brick rectangle near the old docks. Inside, it was strangely clean. A makeshift screen, a few folding chairs, some easels with blank boards waiting for the illusion. Marco's men were everywhere, though you wouldn't have known it if you didn't know where to look. Griffin and his team had positioned people in adjacent buildings, on surrounding streets, even in a boat on the river. Somewhere, vans full of FBI agents courtesy of Elena's months-long side collaboration were sitting dark, waiting for a signal. We were either about to catch a traitor or waste an afternoon playing dress-up. Hours crawled. I went through my fake presentation twice to an audience of 3 of Marco's trusted lieutenants pretending to be investors. Elena paced with her phone in hand, muttering in Italian whenever someone sent her an update. Around the third loop of me explaining imaginary load docks and made-up anchor tenants, Elena's phone buzzed in a different pattern. She listened for all of 5 seconds, then looked up with a glint in her eyes I'd never seen before. They were coming. 3 vehicles, unmarked, a pair approaching fast from the south. License plates that had been tagged in connection with Luca's operations before. Marco moved like a switch had been thrown in his spine. He repositioned me behind a stack of crates near the back of the warehouse, close enough to see the main doors but far enough to be partially shielded. He told me to stay put, but he stayed close, a solid presence at my side. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears as the doors swung inward. 5 men walked in first, weapons obvious, movements crisp and practiced. Behind them, smaller than I remembered but somehow more pathetic, came Nathan. He wasn't in a suit. He was in khakis and a button-down that looked like it had been ironed too long ago. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that hadn't been there when he'd rehearsed speeches in front of our bathroom mirror. He glanced around the empty presentation setup, confusion sliding into irritation. One of Luca's men muttered something about schedules and delays. Then one of them said my name. Not just the architect's wife. My actual name. Marco stepped out from behind the crates before I could think too hard. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He just walked into the open like he was hosting a meeting that hadn't started on time. That was when the guns came up. 5 barrels, all wanting somewhere to point, all landing eventually on him. I should have stayed where I was. That would have been the sensible thing. Instead, I stepped out too, heart thrashing against my ribs, palms slick. Nathan's face when he saw me there is something I will never forget. Shock first, then something that looked a lot like fear. Underneath it all, a flash of the old arrogance, as if he still believed he could talk his way out of anything if he found the right angle. He started to justify himself before anyone asked a question. He said this wasn't what it looked like, that he was just here to make sure I was okay, that he hadn't thought things would go so far, that he'd only wanted to scare me away from Marco. The words spilled out faster and faster, and in his rush to spin his reality into something he could live with, he admitted more than he realized. He admitted he'd shared project schedules with Luca. He admitted he'd taken money. He admitted he'd done it because he was drowning in debt and couldn't see another way out without destroying his political future. He tried, in a last wild reach, to blame me. If I hadn't moved on so quickly, if I hadn't embarrassed him by appearing with Marco, if I'd just stayed down like a good cautionary tale, he wouldn't have had to escalate. Listening to him twist himself into knots, something in me finally snapped. I wasn't the woman on the restaurant floor anymore. I wasn't the punchline in the comments. I told him firmly, in that weird, slow way rage sometimes has, that everything he'd done since the Aurora room had been his choice, his greed, his ego, his fear. I told him that almost getting me killed at a construction site because he'd thrown in with a man like Luca wasn't some tragic misunderstanding. It was attempted murder dressed up as necessity. Maybe he would have tried to defend himself longer. Maybe the men with guns would have gotten twitchier. Maybe everything would have gone completely sideways. We never got to find out. The warehouse doors blew open again, this time with a different kind of force. The kind that comes with federal funding and bulletproof vests. Voices shouted commands. Lasers painted red dots on concrete. Men who knew how to use their weapons professionally fanned out. FBI agents swarmed the room, guns trained on Luca's men. One of them, a woman with iron gray hair and eyes like cut glass, moved with brisk efficiency, directing her team. Within minutes, the men with the original guns were on their knees, their weapons kicked out of reach. Handcuffs glittered. Nathan froze as two agents approached him. You could see the moment his brain caught up to what his mouth had just confessed in front of recording devices he hadn't noticed. They read him his rights. He tried to talk over them. It didn't work. Elena stepped out from somewhere behind a pallet stack, phone still in her hand. There was satisfaction in her posture, but also something like relief. She'd been building a case against Luca for a long time. Tonight had given her more than she'd dared hope for. As they walked, Nathan, past me, his wrists secured, he looked up. For the first time since the Aurora room, we were eye to eye without a crowd of strangers between us. He looked small, not physically, just less. I didn't feel the triumph I'd once fantasized about. There was no swell of vindictive satisfaction, just a quiet, steady understanding that the man I'd planned to marry had been gone for a long time before I noticed. By the time we left the warehouse, the sky outside had dimmed. My legs carried me into the back of the car on autopilot. Once the doors closed and the noise of sirens and orders faded, the adrenaline crash hit. I started shaking. Marco didn't tell me to stop. He didn't tell me it was over, that we were safe now, that everything would be fine. He just pulled me toward him and let me shake. Eventually, the tremors slowed. My breathing evened out. That was when he said it. Not in some grand speech. Not with a ring or a bouquet or a perfect sunset. He said he loved me. He said it like a confession. Like something he'd been trying to talk himself out of for weeks. Like admitting it out loud was the most dangerous move he'd made in years. The thing about almost dying is that it puts a lot of things into perspective very quickly. So I told him the truth back. That somewhere in between the kitchen coffees, the shared silences at 2, the way he'd shielded me at the construction site, the way he'd trusted my professional judgment in rooms where women were usually decorative, I'd fallen in love with him too. We made another agreement that night, without paperwork. No more protection by omission, no more half-truths, no more pretending this was just a mutual transaction we could walk away from untouched. We were in it. Together. 3 months passed. Luca waited for trial in a federal facility with bad lighting. Nathan's mugshot floated through news cycles while pundits dissected his downfall. Charlotte distanced herself with the speed and precision of someone whose family PR team had years of practice. Marco restructured parts of his operations, cutting loose anyone whose loyalty seemed flexible. Some of his B businesses stepped more firmly into the light. Some retreated further into shadows. I opened my own firm. Carter's studio started in a modest space in the West Loop, with secondhand furniture, and 3 people who believed in my work enough to bet their paychecks on it. The first time a client chose us because of my portfolio and not because of any unspoken association with the Santoro name, I sat on the floor between rolls of trace paper and cried. The $500,000 Marco wired after his deal closed paid for the lease, the computers, and the health insurance plan. Every drawing after that paid for my pride. The 6-month contract's end date arrived on a Thursday. We went to the courthouse with Elena as our witness and filed the divorce papers we'd signed the same day we'd applied for the marriage license. It was quick and oddly anticlimactic. A clerk stamped something, records were updated. On paper, our legal ties were severed. On the ride home, Marco asked if I regretted any of it. I told him I regretted the burgundy dress. He laughed, the sound warmer and freer than I'd heard it before. And later that night, instead of going to my room, the room that had always technically been mine, I carried my pillow down the hall and dropped it on his bed. We never moved it back. Not long after that, Elena orchestrated a surprise. I knew something was up when she hovered in the kitchen one afternoon, phone in hand, watching the clock. When the elevator opened, the woman who stepped out made my breath catch. Isabella Santoro had the presence of someone who'd survived more than she'd ever talk about casually. Her hair was streaked with silver, her dress a rich burgundy that made me momentarily hate that color less. Her eyes were the same deep brown as her son's, but softer at the edges. She hugged him first without asking permission. He stiffened for a moment, then melted into the embrace like a boy. Watching it from across the room felt too intimate, like I'd walked in on a family prayer. Then she turned to me. She took my hands in hers and looked at me for a long time, as if she were reading footnotes written in invisible ink along my jawline and under my eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but clear. She said she'd stayed away from certain parts of the family business on purpose. She'd hated watching it take her husband, that she'd almost lost her son to the same shadows, that she'd accepted a long time ago that she couldn't pick Marco's world, only hope he'd pick better within it. She said Elena had told her everything about what had happened, about the construction site, about the warehouse, about the fact that Marco was trying haltingly, imperfectly to do things differently. She told me, very simply, not to let him run from happiness again. Then she kissed my cheek and went to go with her children in rapid-fire Italian about something to do with holiday plans. I didn't catch every word. I caught enough to recognize love in its own sharp way. The idea to go back to the Aurora room was Marco's. He framed it as a celebration for my firm new clients, new projects, the kind of thing that usually involves canapes and awkward networking. But the look in his eyes when he suggested that particular venue said he knew exactly what he was doing. At first, my stomach lurched. The memory of the marble floor and the scattered papers was muscle deep. Then I realized something underneath the nausea. That restaurant wasn't just the scene of my humiliation. It was also the point where the rest of my life had begun to tilt. If we were going to rewrite the story, we might as well do it where the worst chapter had ended. We booked the Aurora room on a Friday night. When I walked in this time, the host greeted me by my own last name first, Carter, then Santoro. It was a small thing, but it mattered. The room looked the same. Chandeliers, city lights, the lake stretching out like a dark secret. The tables, though, were full of different faces. There were engineers and designers I'd worked with on new projects. A couple of clients who'd taken a chance on my tiny studio and who now bragged about it as they'd discovered me. A few politicians who owed Marco favors and weren't willing to let personal discomfort get in the way of good wine. Elena and Griffin were there. So was Isabella, in another beautiful dress that made me wonder if Burgundy had ever betrayed her. Somewhere near the back, Charlotte stood with a drink in her hand, talking to a man I recognized from tech columns. When our eyes met, she offered a small nod. There was no longer gloating in her gaze, just acknowledgement. 2 women who had been adjacent to the same disaster and had walked away in different directions. I nodded back. Later, when the noise had settled into a pleasant murmur and dessert plates were being cleared, Marco tapped his glass lightly. The room quieted. He didn't make a long speech. That was always more Nathan's style. He just told a story. He talked about a night months before, when he'd walked out of this very room and seen a woman in a burgundy dress sitting on the curb, holding onto a stack of blueprints like they were the only solid thing left. He talked about how she'd looked at him with eyes that were hurting but still defiant, and how something in that look had made him break his own rules. He said he'd thought he was offering her an arrangement that would keep his heart safe. He said he'd been wrong. Then he took a small box out of his pocket. For a second, my lungs forgot how to work. Inside was a ring that looked nothing like the one Nathan had placed on my finger the year before. This one was platinum, simple but solid, with a marquise-cut emerald that matched the dress I was wearing that night. He opened the box and, in front of everyone whose opinions were supposed to matter in our two worlds, asked me not as part of a contract, not as a negotiation, but as a man asking a woman to marry him, not for 6 months, not for optics, not for deals, for real. There was a thread of fear in his voice under the steadiness, a recognition that loving me meant gambling with pain he'd already experienced once, a willingness to risk it anyway. I didn't make a speech either. I just said yes. I said it without hesitation, without calculating the odds, without weighing pros and cons on some internal scale. Because by then, the math was simple. The woman who'd walked into the Aurora room in a burgundy dress months before had been afraid of being alone, of being seen as lesser, of being judged for wanting more. The woman standing there in a green dress was still afraid of a lot of things: bullets, explosions, betrayal, the future. But she wasn't afraid of choosing. He slid the ring on my finger. The room erupted into applause and cheers that blurred into a single warm sound. I saw Elena swipe at her eye like a speck of something had flown into it. Isabella had both hands pressed over her heart. Griffin's mouth twitched up by exactly 1 millimeter, which I'm pretty sure was his version of a grin. Later, when the last guest had left, and the staff were quietly resetting tables for the next day, I stood at the window where I'd once stared at my own reflection and tried not to cry. Chicago glowed back at me. The lake was a dark sheet beyond the glass. My hand, lifted to chest height, caught the light on the new ring. Marco came up behind me and slid his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. He asked if I regretted any of it, not just tonight, the whole wild, terrifying sequence of events that had started with a bad dress code and ended with an emerald on my finger. I told him the truth. That regret was a luxury I didn't have much use for anymore. That if I started plucking out individual threads, I might unravel things I couldn't bear to lose. What I had instead were lessons. That the worst moment of your life can be the beginning of something you're not ready to imagine. That being humiliated in front of a crowd is a kind of death, but not the final one. That sometimes the people who hurt you are doing it because they're selfish, and sometimes the people who scare you are the ones who will stand between you and a bullet. I told him I'd learned the difference between a man who wanted me as an accessory to his ambition and a man who saw me as a partner even when my presence complicated his life. We went home after that. Home. Not just the penthouse, but the people inside it. As I'm telling you this now, months later, the city outside our windows looks different to me. Not because the buildings have changed, because I have. I used to think a life worth having had to be safe, to be good, stable, predictable. Now I know better. Now I know some of the best things I have were built in the cracks of plans that fell apart. In the spaces between explosions and arguments and late-night coffee. In the uneasy peace between choosing myself and choosing someone else. If you've made it this far listening to me, there's a good chance you've had your own version of a Lakeshore Tower moment. Maybe not as dramatic, maybe no cameras, maybe just a quiet betrayal in a kitchen, or a breakup text at 23:45, or a job loss that made your hands shake. If that's you, I hope you hear this part clearly. What they did to you says everything about them. What you do after says everything about you. You don't need a mafia boss in a black car to rescue you. You don't need $500,000 or a penthouse or a family with too many enemies. What you need is the version of yourself who gets up off the curb, wipes her face, and decides she won't let this be the end of her story. And if, along the way, you do happen to meet someone who looks at you the way Marco looks at me now, like you're both his greatest strength and his softest spot, I hope you give yourself permission to believe you deserve that too. If you were in my place that night, would you have gotten into that car? Do you think a relationship that starts as a contract could ever turn into something real? Tell me in the comments. I'm genuinely curious how your heart answers that, not your head. If my story made you feel a little less alone in your own mess, or reminded you that disaster isn't always the final chapter, tap like, share it with someone who might need it, and stick around. I have a feeling this isn't the last time I'll be telling you about what it's like to love a man whose world sits somewhere between the light and the dark, and what it's like to refuse to disappear into either.